Fantagraphics store in Seattle isn't actually the Fantagraphics corporate headquarters or anything like that. It's located in Georgetown on the outskirts of Seattle, which is an area full of rail yards and old brick buildings that were once breweries. When Seattle blew up in the 90s, a lot of these places were converted into trendier businesses like coffee shops and art galleries and the like. The store actually shares half its space with a record shop. When you walk in, the records are to the left and the comics are to the right. That's Daniel Clow's art on the window, by the way, his sardonic depiction of a typical Fantagraphics fan, or at least a typical comic book reader. I arrived right when it started and was afraid I might be missing the first minute of a Q&A, but I was being presumptive. It was just a signing session, and actually Bagge was sharing the event with two other cartoonists, Robert Mailer Anderson and John Sack. They were promoting their comic, My Fairy Godfather, and were seated opposite from him. Since I wasn't in a hurry, I looked around the store for a bit before walking over to say hello. I probably visited the Fantagraphics store for the first time over a decade ago, and the layout has never really changed. There's shelves of new releases from the new cartoonists they've discovered, shelves dedicated to their all-stars like Dan Clowes, Jaime Hernandez, and of course Peter Bagge, and also shelves of classic comics reprints that the company has done over the years, from Tales from the Crypt to The Complete Peanuts. The only thing that's really changed over the years is their back room of half-price comics and their shameful erotic comics section, because both of these rooms are a lot emptier than they used to be. All of the old stuff has been picked through over the years, and they ain't making it anymore. But there used to be plenty of buried treasures. The crowd there was pretty decent. There was a steady flow of people coming in and out, but it wasn't mobbed, and I wasn't going to have to wait behind more than a couple of people at any given time to go up to Peter Bagge. Honestly, to my surprise, I did have to work myself up to it. It's not that I haven't met cartoonists in person before whom I really admire, but I'd never before been in the same room as Bagge, and I just found myself feeling nervous. Keep in mind, I started writing the script for this video before going to see him, so I probably would have been feeling a lot more casual if not for the fact that I'd been spending a couple of days prior writing about how great this guy is. I probably should have rehearsed what I wanted to say to him, because as soon as I stepped up with my copy of Hate Revisited number 1, I just found myself dumbly handing it over to him and unable to even say anything. And then when I realized I had gone mute, I just let everything I wanted to say come tumbling all out at once like a mouthful of marbles. Oh, it's so great you're here. I'm so happy you're doing this. I thought for sure that when The Complete Hate came out that would be the end of it. He just kind of smiled and said, yeah, me too. It was all very fanboyish, and, it's probably embarrassing to see someone my age going into that mode, but he just kind of politely smiled and nodded. When he was done signing the comic, I was at least lucid enough to express to him my thanks for bringing back the series one more time, and I told him I couldn't wait to read it, which is all I really wanted to say anyway. So I went to the hipster cafe next door, got some genuine local Seattle coffee, a comfy seat by the window, and I sat down to read my comic. Hate Revisited number 1 puts the series off to a great start. The first big surprise comes from the inside cover, where we find the return of Stretch Pants of all characters, a lovably obnoxious, flamboyantly gay fat guy who Bagge co-created with Dave Carino as a strip for Weirdo magazine back in the day. It occurred to me later that we might see the return of other obscure Bagge characters as side features in this series, because, hey, if he's bringing back Buddy Bradley for one last hurrah, then why not have the backups be other characters who've been languishing in the back of his head? Who else will make an appearance in the next 3 issues of Hate Revisited? Studs Kirby? Martini Baton Jr.? I guess we'll find out. We then jump right into the vintage grunge action via flashback, with Bagge taking us back to Seattle circa 1990 for the story of how Buddy met Lisa. Fittingly, the first lines of dialogue are a couple of natives accusing Buddy and Stinky of only moving to Seattle to exploit their scene. Buddy kids them about that, but Stinky is genuinely shocked, note the sincerity exclamation lines, because, like Bagge, he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. My favorite moment in this little vignette is Bagge's depiction of an earnest performance artist whom Buddy declares to be an obvious daddy's girl. Note the sincerity exclamation lines on her, too. The interesting thing about this opening is that Bagge is pretty successful here at recreating his old black and white crosshatching technique. However, and I mean this with the utmost respect, it's also a bit like reading Peanuts in the later years of Charles Schulz's career. The form is impeccable, but these just aren't the lines of a young man anymore. And I wouldn't even point this out because they're still great drawings, and most of the panels in these flashback scenes throughout the issue do look like they could have come right out of the original series. But when someone goes back to recreate the work of their youth, you can't help making direct comparisons. When the action jumps forward to present-day Buddy and Lisa, we are back in somewhat more familiar territory, since Bagge's been working in color basically ever since Hate switched to color. However, again, it pains me to say, but it has been 13 years since the last annual, and I think you can see the difference here, too. The line work was just a bit smoother. I'll stop going on about that now, because it is immaterial to the enjoyment of the comic. Speaking of Twin Peaks one more time, Hate Revisited felt a little bit like watching Twin Peaks The Return. You're aware that the author/artist isn't the young man they used to be, but there's a gravitas in them returning to write the final chapter of their most famous work, and you can also see them applying everything that they've learned since then. Incidentally, it's been so long since the last Hate Annual that it didn't even register with me at first that Bagge had brought back Buddy's classic look, which he'd dropped in the 2005 Hate Annual for a new look Buddy Bradley, probably to the consternation of Fantagraphics. This is another odd similarity to Twin Peaks The Return. You get the sense that the series has actually been continuing in real time over all the years that it was gone, and now we're just finally dropping back in. Whatever happened with Lisa and her family in Hate Annual number 9 has apparently long been resolved. And somehow, whether or not that had anything to do with it, Buddy and his family are no longer in Jersey, but, yep, you guessed it, Tacoma, Washington. Now, I think Bagge knows that Hate Revisited has to mean Buddy and Lisa revisiting Seattle, and obviously this makes the story a bit more convenient, but I don't doubt he has it worked out in his mind about how we got from the end of Hate Annual number 9 to here. Whatever happened, it seems that they've been here for a while because Buddy has some kind of unnamed work-from-home job, presumably after selling his salvage business back in Jersey. Lisa mentions owing Valerie a post-pandemic visit, which implies they moved sometime before the pandemic. Maybe they saw Val and George once when they did, but not since then, because they're not even sure if Valerie and George are still together. When they go to see Val and George, I was slightly disappointed that they didn't have any kids, only because that was a plot possibility that my friend and I thought would be really funny. What we do get right off the bat is some heated conversation about the Capitol Hill occupied protest, Black Lives Matter, and the Orange Man, as Val refers to him. This is where we realize that the cover illustration was a bit of a bait and switch, because Buddy makes it clear here, and again later in the issue, that he doesn't vote or support any political causes. And this is totally consistent with his personality back in the old days, when he and Stinky famously remarked that the only thing worth fighting a war over was pussy. So yeah, Buddy hasn't turned MAGA despite the hat on the front cover. It's just an old comic book sales trick, like having Spider-Man dead on the cover, and then you read the issue and find out it's a dream sequence or something. This is also consistent with Peter Bagge's beliefs, not because Buddy is an exact stand-in for him, but because Bagge has identified as a libertarian for years. In fact, his regular gig for, I think, over 20 years now has been as a contributor to the libertarian publication Reason magazine. So, a big part of Bagge's politics is simply respecting the right of guys like Buddy to not care about politics. And he's well aware of the accusations that draws of having the privilege not to pay attention to politics because he's a white male, because Val was yelling at him about that all the way back in 1991. The political discussion continues a bit in the subsequent parts of the issue with Buddy and Lisa, although it's not really a discussion so much as it is Buddy continuing to insist he didn't vote for Trump, and she also seems to find his lack of interest more aggravating in of itself than if he were going around wearing a MAGA hat. No doubt Peter Bagge's had this conversation many times. The funny thing about this being such a prevalent theme in this comic is that, much like Buddy himself, the original Hate series was never really political at all. There were references to feminism and racism and gay rights and all of that, but that was more just the periphery of Buddy's world in Seattle. He truly embodied Peter Bagge's old Gen X ethos of what you might call benevolent apathy. And of course, that wasn't good enough for some of his friends in 1991, and it definitely isn't good enough for them in 2024. So I think Bagge is just speaking to the fact that modern society feels more politically loaded than ever, especially when you start talking to old friends, and especially when those old friends happen to have lived at the center of the Capitol Hill Occupied protest in 2020. There's another couple of flashback sequences with young Buddy hanging out with young Val and young George, and in the former sequence there's a clever segue as the black and white strip ends, revealing itself to be a dream that Buddy was having. The story that Bagge seems to be setting up is that Lisa is keen for the old gang to get back together and become friends as adults. This is a bad idea, of course, since only really she and Val enjoy hanging out together. But there's also a ticking time bomb, which is that nobody in the friend group, except Buddy, knows what really happened to Stinky. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and maybe this is just my fanfiction brain talking, but before Hate Revisited was ever announced, I always thought that if Buddy had some kind of reunion with Val, sparks might fly again. She and George were always this unlikely couple, and they're clearly not very close in this issue. And Buddy's relationship with Val was always kind of based on their conflicting personalities, which have only gotten more conflicting, so I think Val might make a move on Buddy. We'll see. The most shocking thing to me in the whole issue wasn't anything to do with Buddy, Lisa, Val, Stinky, or George. It was actually just the page where we briefly see Buddy and Lisa's son Harold all grown up. Because everyone else basically looks the same, especially Buddy, who's reverted to his younger look, but Harold was still a kid 13 years ago, and now he's a young man like Buddy once was. He does seem a lot more well-adjusted than Buddy did. He's working construction and living at home with Buddy and Lisa. He didn't go to college, and there's a funny moment when Buddy realizes that his son doesn't really have a frame of reference for the woke personality type because he was never in that environment. Seeing Harold go out the front door, I felt, as a reader, like some distant relative to the Bradleys who just came to visit and went, "Oh man, Harold's all grown up, what happened?" But that's part of what made Hate so special. Peter Bagge wasn't just going to freeze his characters in time at their most marketable. He was interested in them as people. He wanted to tell stories that were inspired by real life, filtered through a visually cartoony lens. All the great ups and downs of Buddy and Lisa's lives wouldn't have been able to happen without the passage of time. 'Cause that's life. We don't live in a cartoon sitcom. There's maybe a few years in your teens and 20s when it seems that way because your home life or the early days of living away from home have some consistency to them. But then friends come and go, families change, and you hopefully meet the right person to start a family with yourself. Bagge has said in more than one interview that he's always written Buddy to be about 10 years behind wherever he is in life. I first discovered Hate Comics when I was a teenager, so for me, reading about Buddy Bradley was kind of like getting a glimpse of the future. I guess I kind of thought of him as the older Gen X brother I never had. The cool kind of Gen Xer, the one who genuinely didn't care what anyone thought, who would make fun of anyone or anything, who never felt sorry for himself and didn't take crap from anybody. Until Hate Revisited was announced, I don't think I ever really understood how much this series meant to me. Bagge has done lots of brilliant work since then, but as a reader of his, I consider myself very fortunate to have had hate comics in my life and to have gotten into them when I did. And now that I'm grown up and Bagge is giving a proper conclusion to Buddy's saga, I feel like it's already going to be over way too soon. 3 more issues with Buddy Bradley isn't enough, but I'm grateful for them. There's so many cartoon characters where people will say, "Oh, I've grown up with that character," but it's the nature of comics and animation that cartoon characters are almost always frozen in time. Buddy Bradley, though, he has grown up and gotten older with me, and I love him. And more than ever, I still love Hate. I will always have Hate in my heart. Generation X has basically been discarded by history now, but some of their masterworks still endure, and Hate is one of the greatest gifts Generation X ever gave us. Peter Bagge is one of the greatest Gen Xers that ever was. So, thanks again, P-Bagge, for sending Buddy back to Seattle one last time.
Remember the happy things that after